My name is Miriam Gerber, and I'm the research coordinator at the Center for Race and Culture. And it's my great privilege today to introduce our keynote speaker, Christopher Stuart Taylor. He completed his PhD at Western University in History and Migration and Ethnic Relations. He currently teaches at the University of Waterloo in the Department of History and the Arts First program. His administrative roles at the University of Waterloo include serving as the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Advisor for the Equity Office and acting as the Faculty of Arts Black Equity Strategist and Anti-Racism Advisor. He's also a facilitator with the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit. His book, Flying Fish in the Great White North, The Autonomous Migration of Black Barbadians, is available from Fernwood Publishing. Christopher also worked in Ontario Public Service and began his career as a policy coordinator intern in the Deputy Minister's Office at the Ministry of Labour. He was the Diversity and Inclusion Coordinator in the Ministry of Attorney General's Diversity, Inclusion and Accessibility Office, a Senior Policy Advisor at Ontario's Anti-Racism Directorate, and Manager of Social Justice and Change Cluster at the Ontario Correctional Services College. Dr. Taylor is a proud founding member of the University of Waterloo's Black Faculty Collective. I welcome Christopher Taylor for our keynote today. Christopher, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good. I was going to say good afternoon, but I think it's afternoon and everywhere at some point in Canada. So I really appreciate this opportunity. All the folks for the Center for Race and Culture, I really appreciate this. And I want to say, thank you for all those who have signed in this afternoon to listen to this keynote. So thank you very much. And the roundtable previously was fantastic. I got a chance to sit in on that. So this is great. This is a fantastic event. I want to begin this keynote with something a lot of scholars are doing in these spaces with a Black body acknowledgement. And their folks have different iterations of it. For myself, I always need to locate who I am, my positionality. I am a cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied Black male. And I come to you with this conversation, with this keynote today, understanding that there are a lot of folks who are on this call, who are in this conference, friends, family, colleagues who are coming with a lot of pain. And we need to be mindful that for many of us, myself included, this is not a intellectual exercise. This is the reality of who we are and what we do and what we embody on a daily basis. So I want to make sure folks understand that, where we're at this afternoon and the words that you can be hearing from me as well. I also want to acknowledge the ongoing, not just the recent, but the ongoing xenophobia and anti-Asian sentiments and violence that we've been seeing in North America for hundreds of years. And yes, it came back into our forefront with what happened in Georgia, but we need to understand that this anti-Asian sentiment is deep and runs deep. Well before the pandemic, well before COVID-19, coronavirus, anti-Asian sentiment has been alive and well in this country and continues to be alive and well. So I want to just acknowledge that. So we're here to mark, celebrate, discuss, acknowledge the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So March 21st. And the UN, United Nations, defines March 21st as the following. It is, quote, the International Day for the Elimination and Racial Discrimination is observed annually on the day the police in Sharpeville, South Africa, opened fire and killed 69 people at a peaceful demonstration against apartheid passed laws in 1960. I want to think about that for a second. The International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, March 21, is in recognition and remembrance of the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa. Killing, murder of 69 people at a peaceful protest in apartheid South Africa. And this is very important for us to remember. And I want to center the keynote around that. Because today, March 21, so again, the International Day, I know today is the 24th, but today is about the remembrance of violence, of a violent event within a violent society, within apartheid society, within a white supremacist society. So today, March 21, is in recognition and remembrance of white supremacist violence, state-run violence. Let's pause for a second and contextualize this. Let's frame March 21, this day, within the context that we were told to remember: the Sharpeville massacre. We need to remember that racism isn't benign. Racism isn't just about the benefit of the doubt. Racism isn't just about white privilege. Complete side note, Dr. Jen Long and I, we go to the same hairdresser, by the way. Complete side note on that. But it goes beyond this. And we're supposed to remember that on the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. We're supposed to remember that this day is centered around violence. White supremacist violence. Again, not the individual act of a white supremacist as an individual, but a society, an apartheid society, a state-run form of racism, systemic racism, which killed 69 innocent people who were involved in a peaceful protest for their rights. So when we talk about racism, when we talk about the elimination of racism, when we talk about what's the big deal, I'm tired, we've been doing this since May 25th, 2020, let's get over it. The hockey season has started. We have a North Division, let's focus on that. Let's remember why we're doing today and what today exists. Let's shift our lens from this work in EDIR, equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism. Let's shift it from being the, quote, right thing to do, end quote, to it being the, quote, thing we must do to save lives. We need to remember that violence is physical, it's psychological, it's mental, and it's emotional. And the important thing that I always need for us to come back to in, framing this keynote around Sharpeville, around the reasons, the roots of this day, March 21, is that we need to reframe and rethink our historical figures, the Santa Clausification of our particular figures, how we've shifted our understanding of folks like Dr. King Jr. or Nelson Mandela, and completely ignore who and what they're fighting for. Because when folks get into this conversation, they'll be like, oh, okay, Dr. Taylor, white supremacy, why are you saying this? It's racist, and what's this all about? And we get this paralysis through analysis. But let's define apartheid. Because again, today is marking and recognizing what happened through systemic racism. Apartheid was systemic racism. It's literally the poster child of that. And so we can go all the way back to 1857 from David Livingstone. And he stated that, quote, again, this is apartheid, quote, "The great objection many of the Boers had and still have to English law is that it makes no distinction between black men and white. They felt aggrieved by their supposed losses in the emancipation for their Hottentot slaves, and determined to erect themselves into a republic in which they might pursue without molestation the proper treatment of the blacks. It is almost needless to add that the proper treatment has always been contained in the essential element of enslavement, namely compulsory unpaid labor," end quote. That's the root of apartheid in South Africa. That's the root of the Sharpeville massacre. The dehumanization, the marginalization, the exclusion, the reductionism of black bodies to be below than, to be separate from. The legal segregation by, quote, race. In Afrikaans, how we define apartheid is literally meant to be apartness. So we had these ideas and ideologies from 1857, and it was formalized in 1948 by the South Africa's National Party. It went under the guise of being, quote, separate but equal. But then we had these systemic laws, the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act in 1949. You can only marry between your own race. You get the Population Registration Act of 1950, which literally defined race. You get the Immorality Acts of 1927, 1950, 1957, where sexual intercourse between whites and, quote, non-whites was illegal. You had Group Areas Act in 1950. We had the physical exclusion by race. You had the Bantu Education Act in 1953, where indigenous peoples of South Africa, black folk, could not learn in their own languages. Sound familiar? In a Canadian context? And this is very important for us to understand when we look at this day, March 21. Because it was a system of white supremacy, a system of laws that were created to have a have and have not that privileged whites on top and blacks on the bottom. That's systemic racism. That is a systemic racism that allowed the police to kill 69 innocent people. That's our context, folks. That's our context. And if we don't sit with that understanding of our context, how are we going to move forward to do something about it if we truly don't know what the problem is and what we're supposed to remember? Our context for today, particularly as it relates to race and racism, not just in South Africa, but right here in Canada, is understanding that racism is violence. It's violence within a white supremacist state and enforced by white supremacist institutions. So you might be asking, so what? So much happening right now. Dr. Taylor just introduced this, this talk on South Africa, apartheid, Sharpeville massacre. So what? The question I ask for folks then, when we say so what, is really for us to understand our positionality, understand the space that we stand, our individual self, our thinking, our understanding of race and racism, and truly reconcile what we think is the right thing to do or right things to do are, but also acknowledging and addressing that systemic racism and individual acts of racism against blacks, indigenous folks, Asians, other quote-unquote non-white folks, is not only a fundamental barrier to belonging or quote inclusion, but it's by design. It's systemic. It's a foundation that we live and operate within. It is literally the air we breathe. How do we reconcile that? And big things I want us to really think about. Again, I want you to center yourselves here. All right? It's how do you see Canada? How do you see Alberta? Not only how do you see it, but what does contemporary Canada, contemporary Alberta mean to you? And not what Google says, right? Not what the PC, the popular opinion is. But when you step out of your front door, when you go outside, when you're alone with your own thoughts and no one's judging you, what does contemporary Canada mean to you? And I also want us to think about this in the context of settler colonialism. I want us to begin to problematize, to critique, to challenge our accepted norms and ways of being. As I mentioned in the round table, that's one form. When we talk about white privilege, the quote unquote normalization of everything around you is okay for you because it's been built for you. So you don't recognize the disadvantages or the privileges that you may have within those systems. So how do we really engage with race and racism within a settler colonial society? When in this country, in this province, there have been and continue to be ongoing attempts at colonization of indigenous peoples. How do we reconcile when we look at terms of settlement that we are in a settler colonial society? How do we reconcile ideas of quote unquote inclusion, equity, diversity, inclusion, when this country has deliberately played different groups against each other? And we've seen this, particularly with the point system in 1967. We say, hey, we're going to welcome everybody in. Now, we don't care where you're from. We officially deracialized Canadian immigration policy in 1962. Oh, by the way, 1971, boom, we're going to have an official immigration policy that you can be who you want to be and you can live in this country. But then how do we reconcile that by 1969? There was a white paper that came out that wanted to get rid of the Indian Act and assimilate, quote unquote, integrate, quote unquote, indigenous peoples into the body politic as another, quote unquote, special interest group. How do we reconcile that? How do we reconcile as individuals who work in institutions that we, myself included, are effectively agents of white supremacy? How do we reconcile that? I want us to truly sit and think about that for a second. Especially when I keep on using the term white supremacy, I want us to sit there and think, okay, well, Christopher, Dr. Taylor, yeah, I don't have any tiki torches. I wasn't out there on the street. I'm not part of the KKK. I'm not a Proud Boy. So why are you calling me an agent of white supremacy? That's not fair. But I want us to reframe our understanding of white supremacy and truly understand, and this is coming from Francis Lee Ansley, scholar Francis Lee Ansley, that, quote, white supremacy is not just the self-conscious racism of white supremacist hate groups. Ansley instead refers to a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. I want us to reframe white supremacy and understand that quote there and reframe it within why we're marking today, remembering apartheid or remembering the Sharpeville Massacre in 1960, remembering that apartheid was fundamentally founded around the separateness, the apartness, the laws, procedures, and policies that oppressed Black indigenous folks in South Africa. That is white supremacy. The laws, the procedures, the policies, the ideologies that privilege some and disadvantage most. And we need to think about this in the context that privilege and racism are symptoms of a disease. And that disease being white supremacy. We can address the privilege. We can read Robin DiAngelo's book. We can engage in Peggy McIntosh, which is fantastic. But those are just symptoms. That's like the cold medication, right? But we need to get to the disease. We need to first acknowledge that the disease is the undercurrent of all the issues that we have in our society. Exclusion, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. These are diseases of a larger context of white supremacy. We need to address that. So the big question you might have then is, well, okay, you're telling me all this, but what can I do? What can I do? And so what I've done is created a concept called being a racial conduit. And a racial conduit pulls in everything that you heard in the roundtable previously. And at its core, a racial conduit is an individual that recognizes, identifies, and accepts white supremacy as the key organizing principle of society. They understand their spheres of influence and their own existence. The racial conduit subsequently facilitates the removal of racist systemic barriers and something that's really important that was mentioned, particularly in the round table, is that we could look at a particular system and may not seem racist. The admission system, as was mentioned by Irfan. It doesn't seem racist. It's based on merit. But when we start peeling back the layers, you're like, wait a minute. How do we identify credentialism? How do we identify legal papers? Who is being excluded by what we seem as quote unquote normal ways of being? So the racial conduit will see those things. They'll see the fallacies of meritocracy. How meritocracy is a social construction which is a part of a white supremacist society. And the racial conduit will see them, identify them, and then they will make space and create space for change. They will have an uncritical acceptance of systemic racism. They'll know it's there. They'll live their lives through a lens of critical race theory, the normalization of whiteness in our societies. They'll understand the power that and violence that is embedded in all our institutions. They'll understand and go back to the words again, refusing to accept the Santa classification of folks like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and listen to his words when he said it was the white moderates, the ones who were more interested in upholding order, systems, as opposed to justice. They'll acknowledge that. They'll accept the challenge to change it. They acknowledge and accept and admit the power of white mediocrity, the falsehoods of their standing, foundations in society. They will know and hold true that their fabricated sense of superiority is built on and perpetuated by violence. Most importantly, in recognition of March 21, they'll know the history of today. They'll know it's about the Sharpeville Massacre, 1960. They'll understand that today marks a remembered event of state-sponsored white supremacy. And they will not use today to assuage their white guilt, but they'll use today as a galvanizing point, a galvanizing space to make change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. So if people have questions, there is now an opportunity to actually post the questions for Dr. Taylor. So just one moment, I'm just looking at the chat here. How can white people hold spaces for racialized folks in the workplace or in society in general?
I mean, a prime example is someone like Dr. Long. I mean, Dr. Long, listening to the round table there and understanding the work that Dr. Long does, is that's someone who's holding space. And you don't need to, and I think this is a big thing that we need to get across to white folks. You can engage and be critical of the environment that you live in and privileges you, but also doesn't mean you are a bad human being. And I try to really articulate this, particularly as someone who identifies as black. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a cishet, able-bodied black male. And I can sit here and, and talk about white supremacy and be like, oh, well, Christopher, I'm not black, so I don't know. But I can have a genuine conversation about how patriarchy in a heteronormative society privileges me. Because I understand the intersections of oppression, and I also understand the intersections of privilege. So I think the first thing is that white folks need to do is have that true introspection of who they are. And don't cut off your nose to spite your face. Don't just throw up your hands and say, oh, I can't do anything because I'm white and I'm bad. Like, No. You know what I mean? Just understand who you are, understand how this society and this system privileges you, and then you make that conscious decision of how am I going to engage with it, or how am I going to accept it, or how am I going to challenge, circumvent, and navigate it. And this is key with white folks is, don't get stuck. You know what I mean? Don't get stuck. Don't go in there and you see something like, oh, I can't deal with that and move on, or just hold this guilt that you need someone like myself to come in, as a form of trauma porn to make you feel better. Like, no, that's not the space to be in. You know what I mean? It's a space for you to look in the mirror and say, hey, snap, I've been on this earth for X decades and I have these certain benefits because I'm white. Damn, that sucks. Now do something about it.
Thank you. We have a second question. How do you see the role of education in all levels to build this understanding and rebuild the foundation of society, of equity and inclusion, not on supremacy and apartheid?
Ooh, I like that. Whomever asked that question, that's a good question. So I'll just first part there in terms of education, and I'm bastardizing this quote, so I apologize, from Dr. Angela Davis, that education is the key to liberation. I know that's not just Angela Davis's quote, but lots of folks are in that space. Again, education is the key to liberation. And yes, I'm an educator myself too, and I know there's a crowd of folks, and they're right, that we always sit in the awareness, learning, training, whatever, and then we never get into the practice of action, taking that practical and theoretical. But the key for me, it's particularly in educational spaces, like we're here today with McEwen, in these spaces with folks like Dr. Long and Irfan, we need to recognize that one key form of white supremacy is the erasure of non-Eurocentric narratives. The acceptance of curriculum and curricula that is designed to forget certain aspects of our society, of our histories, plural, that are designed to fundamentally fit certain groups of folks who do not fit dominant narratives to a single story that we should all accept as truth. That we leave folks, and even the most benevolent of us, we sit down in these spaces when we're trying to confront anti-Black racism and challenge racism of the deficit model, the cultural competence model, that we need to go and help the other because they just need to get up to where we're at in our society. And so I think that's one of the big keys when we talk about education, is that when we can truly teach folks, and particularly now it's going to touch the space on white supremacy, when we can teach folks what white supremacy is really about, right? The truth of white supremacy. Folks can begin to understand that white supremacy runs way deeper than just a quote unquote white black issue. It's a system of power. It's a system of oppression. White supremacy has been defined and designed to also oppress white people. As Ijoma mentioned in her new book, Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male Mediocrity. White supremacy is a pyramid scheme. If you look at the history of white supremacy, it's a pyramid scheme. It's been designed, particularly if you look at the states coming out of the Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. Google that for me. It's either 1673 or 1676. I'm trying to pull this out the top of my head. With Bacon's Rebellion. Where at the time, particularly in the states, if we're going to focus on the states for a second, that white and black folk were hand in hand. But you had a certain elite at the top that controlled landowners, powerful, what we used to call the 1%ers. They controlled everything. And one of the ways and one of the things they had to do was destabilize the masses, the white and black masses. To destabilize them, you had to tell the white folks, you are going to be better and you are better than every single black person here. No matter how low you are better than the highest black man. And when I say man, that's on purpose. You're higher. And it created this mudsill theory. And it created an environment where white folks are always trying to achieve something that they'll never get. Because those at the top need to maintain that destabilization So no one and all the masses cannot overthrow them. That's white supremacy. There's a diachronic, there's a line between that. But we don't teach folks that. We teach them that's a black and white issue. We teach folks that what happened with GameStop is very different than what's happening with BLM. We don't draw the connections between Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter. Dr. King figured it out with the Poor People's Movement, and then he was killed. Remember that. He wasn't killed for I Have a Dream. He was killed right after he got together the Poor People's Movement when he united black and white poor folks. When he was pushing against the Vietnam War, against capitalism. These are the things that we need to teach young folks.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. We have a question here from Facebook. How can a basic white citizen educate themselves in the interest of this open window for collectively creating fair and just space? And where can one gain some structured, objective unpacking of unconscious biases?
I'm not too sure what a basic white person is, because there's many definitions of basic, and I hope you don't mean that what the youth of the day talk about basic folk. So I'm gonna just say white folk. I mean, there's lots of space for folks to learn. One of the benefits of the internet is there's a lot of information on it. One of the disadvantages of the internet, there's a lot of information on it. But I think the biggest thing, and this is not my space, and there's been a lot of conversations on this, is like, pick up a book and read it. I mean, and if reading is, I love reading, and look at all the books behind me. Look, I'm a historian. This is what I do. But we're in a time now where content creation is huge. Listen to podcasts. You know what I mean? Find something that interests you. And this is one of the things I actually do with my students. So I teach a history of sport course. So it used to be the history of Western sport. And typically we get, a lot of the varsity athletes who would take this course. So I took over a previous course. And, I saw the syllabus, and the publisher sent me the book they were supposed to teach. And I was like, yeah, I'm not going to teach that. And I was like, no thanks. Because I realized it's a moment in time where the people that should be having these conversations aren't. We're preaching to the converted, right? And a lot of times it's an echo chamber. Like everyone who decided to log in today, you wanted to learn, right? You wanted to engage. You weren't forced to do this. You wanted to. So one of the things I did with this course, I was like, okay, cool. Because what they did, they posted the history of Western sport. It was a previous syllabus, so everybody knew what the course was about. We're going to learn about hockey. We're going to learn about the roots of hockey, the roots of curling, blah, blah, blah. So one of those easy courses. And you know what I did? I said, gotcha. I came in there. I was like, look, we're going to talk about rape culture. We're going to talk about misogyny. We're going to talk about hunting, right? And hunting being a white male dominated sport. We're going to do all these things. And people got on the course like, oh, snap. I wanted to talk about sports. I want to talk about LeBron James and Jeremy Lin and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, yeah, cool. I love sport too, but I'm going to come to where you're at, your interest. Your interest is in sport, but I'm going to show you how the history of sport in North America and across the Western world is so confined and so formulated around race and racism, patriarchy, ableism, anti-indigenous racism, settler colonialism. So my suggestion to folks is find something that interests you. You can do the exact same thing with music. You can do the exact same thing with art, with rec and leisure, with clothing, whatever, and start learning the histories around that. Food, if you're a foodie and you're like, hey, I'm going to go make some pad thai. Understand about, culinary colonialism is a real thing. Ask yourself, hey, why is curry Britain's de facto national food? What's the history behind that? That seems interesting. So these are the things that we can kind of do to really get, again, I hate to use the term basic, but, regular white folk, who don't want to be engaged in this, start seeing, the differences and the underlying racial undertones and racism and white supremacy that is founded in the things that they just enjoy on a regular day.
Thank you. Perhaps building on that, I also have a question for you. In the aftermath of all the protests that we saw last year after the George Floyd murder and the increasing public attention on the issue of race, there are now committees created everywhere on equity and inclusion, and there are even positions created where specific people are hired to make changes within organizations. And for sure, that is laudable. But my concern here is that once this issue of racism, which is very much a personal issue, is becoming now something that is regulated by the state, does that exonerate the average person? Because then they can basically sit back and say, well, but we have a committee, we are hiring people specifically for this.
Miriam, I think you jumped into my brain. I literally think you jumped into my brain because I'm going to say the unpopular opinion thing right now. And there's a lot of data that's coming out that supports this, that what we saw during the summer, post May 25th, 2020, was fundamentally performative. Now, we see the numbers. We see the numbers. If you look at some of the numbers, particularly in the States, it's like 76% of people, immediately in June, they're like, systemic racism exists. And then the NFL season started. They're like, what? No, like we don't do that. We need to come to grips with the fact that so much, and again, this is the unpopular opinion, but it's not just my opinion. So it might be an unpopular opinion that a lot of the focus was because people couldn't go outside. And the only way they could go outside and kick it and have fun with their friends during the summer was to be a part of a protest. And okay, we're going to commit, and look, like we read my bio. I mean, I worked in these same institutions, particularly in the anti-racism director for the provincial government. The first thing you can do is kick off a working group or kick off a committee. First thing you're going to do. And people are going to sign up. I'm all about that. Then we're going to put a terms of reference together. Boom. We're going to create a strategy framework. Awesome. And then? You know what I mean? It's coming from James Baldwin that, we always stop in the action because when you act, you're committed. You're committed to doing something. Now, as you mentioned, Miriam, there is that people say, oh, well, I joined the committee and, the institution created this new center or whatever. So it's not my problem anymore. The institution's going to do it. But what we forget, the institution is fundamentally founded on white supremacy. The institution itself is a problem. So once the institution co-opts it, we're screwed. One of the things I tell folks all the time is that once the oppressor co-opts the language of the oppressed, we're screwed. Because what do we now ask for? If the government creates a new center or a university creates a new office, what do you ask for next? Like, we did it. But we also need to recognize, too, that when we are within these systems, we are also agents of white supremacy. Because the system is only going to allow us to do so much. Because if we do more, what's the system going to do? They're going to fire us. They're going to say, oh, well, we don't have any more funding. Oh, our strategic priorities have shifted. Oh, look, we know this. You know what I mean? And we've seen this pattern. That's why, honestly, I should, this is a keynote. I should be, rah, 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 rallying the troops kind of thing. But, a lot of this stuff I see, I'm like, just go on your timeline on Twitter, on Facebook, and scroll to 2014, 2015. We were having the exact same conversation. We don't have to go back to 1960. We're literally having this exact same conversation. If 2014, 2015 is too way back, go to 2016 with TRC. If that's too far back, go hashtag me too.
Thank you. If anybody has maybe a closing question for Dr. Taylor, now would be a good time to post that. And then at 2:00, we will move on to our next segment. So I just want to see if anybody maybe has a follow-up question for you or just a closing question.
I see one here from Chelsea.
Okay. Yes. I'm seeing a repeat of last summer's social media activism now, where there is the pressure for people and companies to make a statement against anti-Asian violence and another burst of performative statements. How can we break the cycle of public performativity?
Start watching the NBA. I mean, the NBA was a prime example of that. You know what I mean? Go buy some Ben and Jerry's ice cream. I mean, at the end of the day, if a big company, is doing this, they're doing it for profits, right? We live in a capitalist society, and one of the things that we forget that racism is capitalism, capitalism is racism. Full stop. You know what I mean? So these are the things that we need to understand, is that if we're going to see ourselves as consumers, and I tell this to students all the time, students, you're consumers. You pay tuition. Like, it's particularly in Ontario when we look at the funding models. I'm sure it's the same in Alberta. If you look at the funding models, the government is no longer funding even what they used to do 20 years ago. They need your dollars. And if you don't give them your dollars, what are they going to do? Understand the power that you have as consumers in a capitalist state. I know I cut that short, but I'm being mindful of time.
Great, thank you so much. This was an amazing talk, and I really appreciate some of the concepts that you also brought up, especially your comment on the embodiment and the body acknowledgement. That was new to me, and I really appreciate it. It certainly gave me food for thought. So we are very happy that we've had the opportunity of having you speak to us here today. So we will be back at 2:15. So if people need to go and just have a cup of tea or just stretch their legs, please go ahead and do that. And then you can be back at 2:15 for our next session. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. And I hope you have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.